All right, thank you very much for that introduction. So for my talk, I'll be talking about defining the podcast ecosystem. Even if you're a beginner podcaster or you are a veteran podcaster, or your role in the podcast environment or the world of podcasting can range from being one of the key members of a hosting company, right? Such as, Gary with Captivate, or a community manager for Squadcast, like Ariel. This is very important because before you even dive into the world of podcasting, you want to know who are the players, who are the people that are making moves, who are the ones that are redefining podcasting, not only in general, but also in your context, your environment, your region. So let me just try and do a screen share. Now, can everyone see this? Is this okay? Right. Okay. Fantastic. Right. So don't worry about the tech. This is going to be a very strange presentation. It's a lot of my notes, so there's barely any pictures. So I'm really sorry for that. But the goal of this talk is, once again, to ask yourself the question, how do you position yourself as a blank by knowing the podcast ecosystem around you, right? A podcaster? Are you the founder of a podcast network? Are you an app developer? Are you a VC interested in specific podcasts within specific spaces, and you're looking at podcasting as a medium? These are just examples, but as viewers of this presentation, and also for my fellow speakers, I'm learning a lot as well from hearing all of you present your points. These are questions that should be answered gradually over time. So as you're listening through this experience, I hope that you'll try to find the answers to these questions, not only within this presentation, but also outside, once you start your show, right? Or once you start your company. So a little bit about me. As mentioned before, I'm the Chief of Business Development at Renegade Radio. We're based in Malaysia, and we're a podcast network and production company. Very simple introduction there. And I call myself the podcast rainmaker, but that's just a very, very pretty name for, I just do all the podcasting stuff within the company. That's actually the main point of it. You can find my contact there if you have any questions or comments. But I wanted to actually add this in because of how I actually got to this point. Before I became Chief of Business Development of Renegade Radio, I started one of my shows, one of my podcasts that is based off of this chicken, which is the logo for a show that I built called Pod Lovers Asia. This is a show where I have interviews with founders, producers, musicians, people that are involved in podcasting, right? That are contributing or influencing Asia's podcast ecosystem, right? So my mission here is just mapping it out. Who has presence in Malaysia? Who has presence in Singapore? Who has presence in Indonesia? Who has presence in Japan? The reason why is because each and every country or each and every nation or each and every region has its own market, but that market is based off of an ecosystem as a foundation. So in this talk, I wanted to share my notes on how I came to be thinking about ecosystem versus markets, and to provide you with some questions as to how can you define the podcast ecosystem within Middle East and Northern Africa, the region, as well as your relevant context. Are you building a podcast for your city, your country, a specific demographic, or a specific space, a specific social media channel? These are questions you should be answering and reiterating over time. So with that, let's get started. Ecosystem and market. It sounds pretty similar, but let's go with market, right? If you want to define a market, in a very simple term, you have supply and demand. In a podcast context, that means supply as in podcasters and all of their podcasts and their shows and their episodes and all these amazing conversations and stories. And then demand, which is the listeners, right? The show is there for someone to listen to. So there's a demand for shows to be listened to, and then there's a supply of shows for people to listen to. And that is a market? Most of the time, to define this market or to add more detail to this, interesting interaction, we want to think about it in 3 different aspects. Technical data, which is something that you would see from the previous resources that we were shared before, not only in this session, but also in the opening ceremony. The Infinite Dial is an amazing resource. Of course, many speakers will be referring to this because it is once again, the gold standard in terms of market research for technical data. Numbers, percentage listenership rates, salaries for producers, revenue gain for podcast ads. They give us a practical outlook. They give us an idea of the market in numbers, in number format. And also community, right? This is the humane aspect of a market. The number of discussions, people talking about a show, Facebook groups, aggregators, the number of companies within the industry talking to each other, right? All that buzz and activity and all the news that is covering everything that is related to podcasting, not only from a global standpoint, but also a local standpoint. Do you have a podcast news publication based in Middle East or Northern African region? I'm not too sure. But if there is, that is going to be a pillar of your ability to recognize to what extent is the market in there. Because people will go to there for the primary resource, for knowing how many listeners are there in my region, for example. Backtracking a little bit, the third part is market specifics. Now, I don't want to cover this at the moment. I will detail it out later because that is going to be very important for an ecosystem. We've covered what a market can be, right? It's just all the podcasts, it's just all the listeners talking to each other. But why should we think in ecosystems? This is probably one of the most important questions for me, not only as a podcaster, but also as someone who is very, very interested in this, shall we say, in this space, because I had trouble trying to answer this question for Malaysia, right? I started Pod Lovers Asia out of frustration. I actually started this show because of Pod News. So James Cridland is an inspiration, or one of the inspirations behind me wanting to start the show, because I was frustrated at the lack of coverage for podcasting activity within Asian countries. So I decided to build that show to build the foundation for what happens when I start, shall we say, reaching out to people and understand it personally, firsthand. So meeting out with guests in India, in Philippines, in Australian companies tapping into Asia. What have they come across, right? What obstacles, what benefits, etc. So why should we think in ecosystems? Because listeners and podcasters need each other. The markets need both to sustain itself. But then the ecosystem is what supports the market. So who is in the ecosystem? Now, an ecosystem is kind of a very broad, broad definition. It's very, very broad. Anyone who has a modicum of influence, a small amount of influence in podcasting, has a role to play in a podcast ecosystem. Let's go with the most direct, obvious example. So the producers of a podcast can be the hosts, the editors, the ones who are grabbing the footage, so the interviewers, right? Or even guests coming in for a show that are coming in externally. Maybe it's an expert or a scientist that is coming onto your show, and you're like, wow, you have an amazing voice and amazing opinion on this. Let's bring you onto the show, and you create content together. So these are all part of production. So anyone who's involved in production falls under the category of producers, and that is, that counts. You're part of the ecosystem. Podcast networks as well, right? The big ones being, Gimlet or Wondery, etc. Renegade, our own. We have a podcast network within Malaysia as well, so we would count. This means that we are the, shall we say, we count as the umbrella whereby podcasts nested under our brand receive that level of support. So when you think about ecosystem within this context, networks help with dealing with the back-end part of a podcaster who is trying to just, continue producing content, trying to build it consistently, trying to up the quality. But the barriers behind them trying to keep that up can increase, such as, agreements or legalities or trying to find contracts for getting ad slots? What if that's a lot of work? What if that's a lot of, manpower that is taken away from you wanting to produce a great show? So maybe some independent podcasters can fit in here, which I forgot to also put in here, indies. So indies is just independent podcasters. Essentially, these are podcasters who are hobbyists, professional podcasters that are not affiliated with any network or any larger group or entity. They are also part of the ecosystem. Podcast companies as well, right? We have hosting platforms all over the world. A few were mentioned in the very beginning, right? In the opening ceremony. And we have, Captivate as well in this session, and Buzzsprout and Anchor from Spotify as well. And we also have distribution platforms. So when you think about the timeline from when a podcast goes from production to reaching out to the listener, these are the people right in the middle. These help create the vehicle from which a podcast MP3 file goes from beginning to end. There's so many gears in here, and they are all important, right? They are all very, very important. And an extra note here as well, Squadcast is very, very important because that's one of the most seamless ways in recording the content for a show, right? So we also have, tools for creating podcasts as well that fall underneath this category. So now we have listeners and podcasters, and now we have the companies that are right in between. They help support it, right? So who is supporting all of that interaction? This is where it gets pretty complicated, or this is where it gets very, very detailed. And I feel that we should take this very slowly, one at a time. So when we think about the interaction between a listener and a podcaster, and all the podcaster wants is to reach out to the listener, the way to do that is via the medium of their show. To enable that connection, then you have the middlemen, right? The podcast companies, the open RSS feed, the state of the industry, etc. All of that, the ability to allow that transaction to happen is the ecosystem in itself. So when you're defining a podcast ecosystem, one, how is this transaction happening, right? If I get to push out a show for free, where's the money coming from? What about the legal aspects? What if I use music that has some level of copyright involved in it? What if I require a license, right? That's some example. Who's creating complementary content in accordance with your show, right? So this can be, for example, your show notes writers, your musicians who are writing your custom music, the people in charge of outreach, the ones who are managing your community on behalf of you, and also the ones who are managing your social media. That's also, although they sound like they're one and the same, these descriptions can be so detailed and they're intensive that it justifies having another person for the job. And where does the labor come from for that, right? So for some podcasters, if they're independent and it's too much for them, sometimes they would outsource it to an agency to help produce their show, a freelancer to do something for them. Or if you are a person trying to dive into the podcast industry, you want to join a project, right? Maybe you want to be a host temporarily. I have seen some cases of people who have posted out job descriptions of hosts temporarily for a season or two to be a host for a couple of episodes, paid gig, and you have to have a portfolio of work within podcasting industry to be, to fill that prerequisite. But who's providing that? So when you're trying to answer these questions, they all have people behind them. They all have entities behind them. They all have entities that you find not just within podcasting. So when you're trying to think about the locus of the podcasting ecosystem, and the most micro moment, it will be yourself, the podcaster, and then you have other podcasters. But then if you zoom out a bit, it will be the companies that are helping you push your podcasts, and then you have your social media accounts. But then if you zoom out a bit, you have the infrastructure that allows you to enable that to be sustainable, enable that to continue. So some examples of indirect players, and what I mean by indirect, I mean those who may have touched on podcasting in some way, or those who are looking from outside the box of podcasting and are diving right into it include businesses about to get right into podcasting, starting their own versus going on podcast tours, right? Aladdin's talk on how a podcast can be a brand's best friend is heavily aligned with this, because a lot of businesses have this amazing one golden rule when it comes to starting a podcast under the business, and that is this podcast is designed to humanize the company. If they look at it from that point of view, they'll be diving into the podcast ecosystem, but for a specific intention, right? That is, either calls to action for a business product or whatever it is. Another is VCs, right? If you're a venture capitalist and you're interested in investing in specific parts, where do you get your due diligence for specific companies, right? You want to hear how the founder acts and sounds like in a conversation. You check out where they have guested. You want to find out whether this business is viable, worth your time and money even. Then you want to see if they have a way or a blog or a piece of content that you can follow. A podcast is one way of doing it. So these are not only people interested in actually injecting potential money into the economy or ecosystem of podcasting, but also want to use the podcast as a medium, the podcasting medium, diving in and diving out to get what they want and going back right out. So who are serving these specific audiences? And the other indirect player is content creators. Content creators are already doing all sorts of things, from creating a YouTube channel or starting a blog or having an amazing newsletter, etc. What if they go right into podcasting? Sometimes they have an advantage where they already have what I call star power. So star power is when you already have a large following, where it pulls your resident audience. Resident audience is a term I use to describe your audience that resonates the most with your mission or message, regardless of medium. Regardless of medium. So that means that you can convert a number of your most loyal fans, even if you switch from, say, a YouTube channel or a blog to a podcast, because what if they want to hear your voice, right? These are possibilities. These are all indirect players, and sooner or later, they're going to be part of listeners or podcasters. Zooming out even more, right? We also have to think about smartphone penetration or tech in general. How are people listening to podcasts in, say, Middle East or in North Africa or in any part of the world? What operating system are they using, right? Are they Android heavy? Are they iOS heavy? Do you have data on listeners listening to your show on the browser and what have you? Now, specific stats on smartphone penetration. The mobile operating system market, Saudi Arabia, I've just pulled this just from today. Let me see if I can get this right. We are looking at above averaging 60% a market share of Android, more so than iOS, right? iOS is around 40 to 50, which is great. That's fantastic. So rather than looking at this from a comparative point of view, as a podcaster or as a founder or as a company, the question then is, are you creating your podcast in a way where it is accessible by average 60% of Android OS users in Saudi Arabia, for example, or average, 42%? Average 42% in Saudi Arabia for iOS. Similarly, in United Arab Emirates and UAE, there's a greater disparity, right? Greater usage of Android in UAE, above 64%. This is pretty high. I'm looking at this. Looks like 3/4, right? As compared to iOS. Now, I'm not looking at this from the point of view of like, oh no, you should focus on one. No, you should focus on two, because you should also focus on the accessibility of such. That means that the ecosystem for these two specific countries dictates that if your accessibility for, say, Android is much greater, much easier, much faster, it would generally be assumed to be easier for you to capture the overall potential listenership and or potential consumers that are already using Android OS mobile devices. That is one way for you to determine or have a step one of your definition of a podcast ecosystem. There's also other things like accessibility and internet speed and even language as well. But to cover that specifically, let's take a look at market specifics. So market specifics are basically specifics of each country or each region that are unique to that region. So this could be very, very different to Middle East and Northern Africa as compared to where I am based in Asia. So in Southeast Asia, we've had a number of cases where some arts funds and grants have provided money to help fund Malaysian podcasts for cultural heritage. That has been done, has been proven. It's actually one of our shows under Renegade Radio. It's called Kita Podcast, which is pretty great. It aims to cover fiction and prose and the creative arts by Malaysians within the country. And yes, it's a grant. So there has been money has been in, right? So grants are a possibility for podcasts, and it's already been seen in Asia. How about your specific country? How about your specific context? Who is providing initiatives, grants, and levels of governmental infrastructure to help push your podcast to a greater level? Is a question that you should try to answer over time as you're thinking about this. As you're listening to this, I would prefer that you think about this from not only a podcaster's point of view, but a researcher's point of view. I would like you to think of yourselves as individual infinite dials, right? Because sometimes a lot of data, just because you have a ton of data out there in the world doesn't mean all of it will be relevant to you. I want you to look at data that you think will serve your mission better. In this case, cultural heritage and grants, it helped for Renegade. These are just great examples. Influence of digital media in external markets is also, for Asia, a very unique one as well. And I'm sure my fellow speakers can also speak for their own respective regions. So the influence of digital media could mean the influence of content from outside of the country or outside of the region coming into the region. An example of this is a lot of podcast listeners from Malaysia, English language podcast listeners will be listening to content based in the US. So we'd have, that results in greater competition. But if you switch languages to, say, Mandarin Chinese or Hokkien, or even Bahasa Malaysia or Malaysian, there's the ability to hone your resident audience, hone in on the audience that has the greatest chance of being loyal to you, drastically increases. So once you know about the influence, where are people listening? What are people listening to? Then you know where to make the right choices. You know where to go, oh, okay, I shouldn't focus on that. I should focus on this. External markets as well. This is a little bit more global. This could mean, the level of penetration rate for specific companies, right? To what extent does Spotify have presence in Malaysia? To what extent does Apple Podcasts have presence in ASEAN region or in Asia, which has very little, because Asia, from what I remember, I think, please don't quote me on this, I think it's around 17 to 18% smartphone penetration for iOS. So less likely for Apple Podcasts listeners to be based in Asian countries. There are listeners, but if you're sticking to just one OS, you are missing out on a huge opportunity there. So with that being said, there's a lot happening for an ecosystem, right? So many players, right? Our fellow speakers here on this session now are players in this ecosystem. As you are part of Podlines PodCon, you are also part of the ecosystem. People here, as you're listening to all this information, you have an advantage because now you have a greater, clearer idea of what constitutes a podcast ecosystem. But all of this is used to serve only one thing or one person, your listener, right? What's their experience? Do they listen on Castbox? Do they listen on Good Pods? Do they only listen on Spotify on their laptop or on their web browser? This is when we start to think about things like, in the Middle Eastern, North African region, what percentage of listeners would be listening to my show in Spotify, in iOS, in Apple device, in Apple Podcasts, etc. You start to get a clear idea of where are the people? Where are the players? Where are the companies? Who's thriving at most? Because once again, your goal here is to figure out, how do you capitalize on knowing all of this, right? It's like you're like a cartographer, right? You're like charting a map. You're drawing a map of the region, and you want to pick the best spot to start your city or whatever it is, to start your show, right? You want to pick the most strategic spot, but you need information, right? Some examples of market specifics is that we have one podcast in India where, the Indian podcast market is rising by a lot. The Indian Noir podcast has been acquired by Spotify. I'm not sure by how much, but they have been acquired and now they're exclusive to there, which is a horror fiction narrative storytelling podcast. Very rarely unheard of in Asia, but Nikesh Murali, the host, also a good friend, has been hustling so much and creating high quality, consistent content, and engaging with the community just 100% of the time from start to finish. So Indian Noir is a great example of all of the advice that you've been hearing in these sessions up until now. South Korea, highest listenership rate in the world, 58%. That means 58% of South Korea has listened to a podcast. I don't even know the actual population of South Korea, but it's a lot. We're talking about millions of people. Can you imagine millions of people? You just go up to someone and say, hey, do you listen to podcasts? There's a 58% chance of them saying yes. So when you have data such as that, you can get an idea of just how stable or just how powerful a market or an ecosystem within that context can be. And I wrote US there, although I think we've had plenty of people showcasing how great the US market is. But basically, the podcast ecosystem within the US is very, very stable. And you have plenty of support, plenty of monetization channels. But after hearing Aladdin and Amir's talks throughout this session, we know that the Middle Eastern and Northern African region is rising rapidly, right? You want to know your proximity. You want to know your network. You want to know to what extent can you penetrate another market. But that depends on whether or not you can do anything in that ecosystem. But first, to do anything, you need to know the ecosystem. But yeah, what can you do, right? So just some questions. What is your role in a podcast ecosystem? How will you become a part of this space? And if you just look around you, who are also podcasting, who are also part of these like companies, etc. Your goal is to create a win-win situation, because podcasting is a very win-win situation. When someone wins in podcasting in the ecosystem, you also win, because that means there's more listeners, there's greater normalization of listening behavior. And when you have an audience there and collaborating with them, there's a chance that you can tap into that audience as well. So band and collab together a lot, according to your resident audience, of course, and no spam, because obviously it's better to be kind than to be ruthless in podcasting. And as much as I have talked a lot about, defining a podcast ecosystem, honestly, it is better to execute with clarity than with blindness. So after this great overview here, I hope you're going to be okay with understanding like, okay, I can talk to this person because this person is really good at this in podcasting. But please watch out for analysis paralysis, which is basically another fancy way of saying too much information and I'm going to hesitate. Please do not hesitate. Podcasting is meant to be a fun struggle. It's not easy, but it's very, very rewarding. And with that being said, that's to the end of my presentation. If you want to reach out to me, you can just email me right here. And also the website for Renegade Radio is rngdr.com. And you can also tweet at me at Norman CHELLA. And that's
Thank you. Thank you, Norman from Malaysia. Thank you very much for your great presentation. I have a question for you. As a broadcaster, which better for me? Targeting niche groups or mass groups? Which better for me?
This really depends on your mission or message. When you think about creating a show and asking yourself, do I want to make this to create a huge net to capture as many listeners as possible versus serving only a small amount? That's two types of thinking. That's different already, right? It would be the same as saying, I want to be a writer. Do I pick nonfiction or fiction? This means that there are two different mindsets for thinking. So let's try to answer both. When you want to capture a mass group or large group, you want to make sure that your content is varied, easily accessible from any channel, and wide serving as much as possible. Versus if you choose to go with a niche podcast, it is easier to serve that podcast, or like that audience rather, because you know what topics will fit that the most, which means that it is more sustainable and easier to grow steadily compared to a wide-ranging audience. I would recommend going with a niche podcast and only dedicating yourself to a wide-ranging audience if your star power can dictate you talking about a wide range of topics. Otherwise, if you try to make it all into one podcast and people only follow you for only one topic, there's going to be some conflict there. So maybe, you can start a secondary podcast or another feed, or you make the pivot to make it wide-ranging. So there's going to be different ways to tackle this. You can go with both, and you can also change between both halfway through. There is no wrong answer. There is only, what's the word for it? Hesitation behind picking what's the right answer. So don't worry about it.